Now, the other thing I would add, and let's go ahead and switch because we're running out of room here. Let's blow this up. The other thing I would add is one of the things that also happens is this nutritional deficiency issue. Now, a lot of people don't know this history about the United States, but in the year 1943, grain sales were actually prohibited in the U.S. So this is U.S. history. Why? Why were grain sales inhibited in the United States? Because grain was responsible for approximately 8,000 deaths. And this is grain not related to gluten or gluten sensitivity, but it's grain related to malnutrition. So 8,000 deaths annually. So per year, grain was responsible for killing about 8,000 people a year. How was it doing that? It was doing that through a disease called beriberi. And it was also doing that through a disease called pellagra. So if you've ever heard of vitamin B1 or niacin, vitamin B3, these are B vitamin deficiency diseases that can kill you if you become too deficient. And what was happening was grain itself was creating deficiencies that were so great that it was leading to deaths through beriberi and pellagra. So what the government did is they sold or they banned the sale of grains unless, this is where fortification came in. So, you know, most of you aren't old enough. I wasn't old enough, right? I wasn't born before 1943, or I wasn't cognizant in 1943 to understand these things. But fortification actually came from the fact that grain was responsible for causing malnutrition to the level that it was creating as many as 8,000 deaths per year. And so this is when you saw on those food labels, this is why they began fortifying with B1, with B3. Okay, they began fortifying with iron. They began fortifying with major nutrients. So when you flip over and you look at an ingredients or a supplement facts panel, nutritional facts box, you're always going to see, no matter what the grain product is, if it comes in a package or a wrapper, by law it cannot be sold unless it's fortified with synthetic vitamins and minerals. And so what the food manufacturers did, they got really smart. The cereal manufacturers and the bread companies, they didn't say, hey, don't eat us because we're going to kill you, causing you to have malnutrition. What they said instead is, hey, now we're fortified, so we're even better for you. So now make cereal and bread a daily part of your essential meal or your breakfast, right? And so the other thing that a lot of people don't realize is this came on the heels of the Great Depression. And so one of the other things that happened during the Great Depression is we had subsidies. So grain subsidies, so in essence, your tax dollars were taken from you to feed the farmer's back pocket. And this was done to prevent farmers from going out of business and creating a massive food shortage in the United States during the Great Depression. I don't argue that. I think it was an okay thing to do. I think you've got to keep the farmers growing food or we're going to starve to death. However, these subsidies still exist today. And we're not, arguably, well, we may be going through a Great Depression here pretty soon, but we're not currently going through a Great Depression in that regard. So you have to understand, today, who are the farmers? Now, there are still small company farmers. Definitely that still exists. I won't deny the existence of that. But the vast majority of your farmers are corps and corporations. And if you look at the interlocking relationship between Big Pharma, so we have Big Pharma, we have Big Food, and we also have, unfortunately, Big Government. And so what happens is Big Food takes your tax dollars to grow genetically modified processed grains and sell them back to you, okay? And it comes with gluten and processed additives, excessive carbohydrates, nutritional deficiencies, and overcoming that, we're adding synthetic vitamins instead of real vitamins. Gluten comes with an increased risk of infection. There's a lot of evidence that shows that people with gluten sensitivity issues have much greater risks of developing infections that can trigger cancer, which is what we've been talking about. It comes with molds and mycotoxins, it comes with toxic metals, and it comes with pesticides. And I would argue that all these things are really designed to kill most people, right? If we were trying to slowly and insidiously poison millions of people, this would be like the perfect plan that no one would suspect, because nobody's going to eat a piece of bread and die tomorrow. That's just not the way it works. It's a slow poison. But we've got big food. This is what they're growing. This is what they're producing. And they're taking your money to do it. So they're taking your money through subsidies to poison you. And then you have more subsidies because your tax dollars now also go, because big government takes your money. Now they mandate that you have to have health insurance, and so that's a form of taxation. And that health insurance, what does it cover? It covers drug-based treatment. So it covers drug treatments. Okay, so what is drug treatments? That's big pharma, folks. And so now you've got a government that takes your tax dollars to grow your food that's actually poison. You've got a government that, basically says you have to have insurance, and that the insurance will cover drug therapy. And the drug therapy is the other set of corporations called Big Pharma, which produce the vast majority of drugs. And if we look at, what did I say a moment ago? I didn't put this slide. I wish I would have put this slide in here for you. But if we look at number 1, number 2, and number 3, causes of death in the United States, we could argue heart disease. We could argue cancer. And we could, like I said earlier, they kind of can swap places between 1 and 2. But the third leading cause of death in the United States is pharma. And I'm not talking about accidental overdose here, folks. I'm talking about properly prescribed meds, properly done, not doctors making mistakes, not, oops, I gave you too much of a dose. I'm talking about properly prescribed medications. Recent study published in the British Medical Journal found that properly prescribed medications were responsible for almost 250,000, and some would estimate even higher, 250,000 deaths a year, making it the third leading cause of death in the United States. So let that sink in for a minute. Let that sink in. Your food is grown by big corporations that are connected to the same companies that feed, when the food makes you sick, these same companies take your tax dollars to feed you drugs to treat what? What are you treating? This is where it really gets interesting, because pharma is the way that we treat heart disease, and it's the way that we treat cancer. So the way we treat number 1 and 2 leads to number 3. If that's the scenario that you desire for yourself and your family, by all means, keep doing what you're doing. But if you want a different solution, you want a different scenario, and I highly employ you to take a greater look at this. Again, it's not just about gluten. Many of you have come to me and said, Dr. Osborne, what about glyphosate? Is it the glyphosate? Has gluten always been an issue? Look, gluten has always been an issue. The oldest known case of gluten sensitivity dates back 2,000 years BC. We know gluten has been a problem. Has gluten been the big problem? Has it been as big a problem as we see it today? Yes and no. I would argue probably not. I would say when you add pesticides and toxic metals and mold and mycotoxins, when you add poor nutritional density, when you add a diet of excessive carbohydrates, and you take all these grains and you, for the most part, you put in a bunch of food additives and other chemicals like meat glue, and you process it, none of these things have anything to do with gluten. But gluten-induced inflammation is a very real problem. So let's not just ignore that either. But we have to look at these other components, because these other components, which are not necessarily directly gluten-related, but are just inherent properties of grain, which you have to understand, why is it that everybody says grain is such a staff of life or a staple food? Most cultures didn't consume the level of grain that we in the United States or in industrialized countries consume, nowhere near the level of quantity. And so we're seeing gluten sensitivity increase in part because of the quantity. Look at the sizes and the servings and the portions of food as it's served in restaurants today. Look at the size of people in the United States today. Like if you look at general statistics, 50% of the United States is overweight. 40% is obese, morbidly so. And this was not always the case. So I think we can make the argument, and part of it, that since grain was subsidized and we've made it the base of the food guide pyramid. Now the food guide pyramid is changing, which is, I'll give them credit for at least making the change. But for years, for decades, the base of the food guide pyramid was 8+ servings of grain, right? Which comes with all these properties. Why? Because the government was taking your tax dollars to pay big corporations to grow slow poisons for you, and that was feeding the system. Again, now Big Pharma can come in and rescue you from yourself.
Hey, don't forget to check out the rest of the series right here. Make sure you hit subscribe below. And as always, thanks for tuning in.